It happened in broad daylight, not in a dark alley, not during a chase, not after a crime. A quiet street, a clean car, and a man who had done absolutely nothing wrong. BruceLee slowed the vehicle, following the signal without resistance. No panic, no anger, just calm compliance. He had faced pressure before, cameras, crowds, expectations, but this was different. This wasn't Hollywood. This wasn't a movie set. This was real life. The police officer approached slowly. His eyes didn't scan the license plate first. They didn't check the registration. Instead, they lingered on the driver's face, on his appearance, on assumptions formed in seconds. Then came the question that changed everything. Where did you get this car? It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't routine. It was an accusation disguised as a question. BruceLee answered politely, clearly, truthfully. He explained that the car was his, that the paperwork was in order, that there was no issue at all. But the officer didn't listen, because in that moment, logic had already been replaced by bias. The words that followed were quiet, but heavy. Heavy enough to freeze the air around them. This vehicle has been reported stolen. No proof was shown. No confirmation was made. Just a statement, sharp enough to stain a reputation instantly. People nearby slowed down. A passerby glanced over. Another car paused longer than it should have. In seconds, the scene shifted from ordinary to dangerous. Not physically, but socially. Because accusations don't need to be true to cause damage. They only need to be spoken aloud. BruceLee remained still, calm, collected. Inside, however, he understood something deeply unsettling. This wasn't about a car. This was about perception, about power, about how fast a life can be questioned without evidence. And as the officer stood there, convinced he was in control, he had no idea that this single moment, this single accusation, had just set off a chain of events that would end his own career far faster than anyone could imagine. Because when truth collides with prejudice, the consequences are never equal. The officer didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Authority doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers and still expects obedience. He took a step closer, close enough to feel intrusive, close enough to make the situation unmistakably clear. This was no longer a casual stop. This was an assertion of power, a silent message that said, I decide what happens next. BruceLee noticed the shift immediately. The officer hadn't checked the system. He hadn't asked for confirmation. He hadn't even asked for identification beyond the first glance. Instead, his focus remained fixed on the same assumption he had already made, that this man did not belong behind the wheel of this car. Step out of the vehicle. It sounded procedural, routine, almost harmless. But procedures, when driven by bias, become weapons. BruceLee complied without hesitation. No sudden movements. No resistance. He stepped out slowly, hands visible, posture relaxed. He understood something most people didn't. Escalation often begins not with action, but with reaction. A second officer arrived moments later. Not because of evidence, not because of protocol, but because the first officer had already decided this situation was serious. The word serious carries weight. It invites judgment. It attracts attention. Now there were two uniforms, two sets of eyes, two versions of the same assumption. Around them, curiosity grew. A shopkeeper paused mid-task. A pedestrian slowed down. Someone across the street pulled out their phone, not to record but to watch. The presence of police alone was enough to suggest guilt, even when none existed. BruceLee stood quietly, listening as the accusation repeated itself. The vehicle matches the description. A vague phrase, conveniently flexible, impossible to disprove on the spot. Bruce asked calmly to see the report, the date, the plate number, anything that could clarify the situation. The response was cold. That's not how this works. Those 5 words stripped the moment of fairness. Because suddenly, truth wasn't something to be verified. It was something to be challenged. And BruceLee realized he was no longer being treated as a citizen, but as a suspect whose innocence needed to be earned. The officers spoke to each other in short phrases, just loud enough for him to hear. Suspicious. Doesn't add up. Keep him here. Each word landed like a quiet verdict. Yet Bruce didn't argue. He didn't plead. He didn't raise his voice. His calm wasn't weakness, it was discipline. Years of control, both physical and mental, had taught him that dignity is strongest when pressure is highest. What the officers didn't realize was that this stop had already crossed a line, because somewhere in the system, a dispatcher, a supervisor of a record that couldn't be altered, the truth was waiting. And once it surfaced, it wouldn't just clear BruceLee. It would expose the recklessness of an accusation made too quickly, the danger of authority guided by prejudice, and the irreversible consequences of assuming guilt without proof. This wasn't just an uncomfortable encounter anymore. It was a test of accountability, and the clock had already started ticking. Time began to stretch in unnatural ways. What should have taken minutes started to feel endless. The street that once felt open and ordinary now felt smaller, tighter, like the walls were closing in without ever moving. Every passing second carried weight, and every silence felt louder than words. BruceLee stood where he was told to stand. Not restrained, not charged, not free, suspended in uncertainty. The officers moved with quiet confidence, the kind that comes from believing you are untouchable. One of them spoke into the radio, repeating details that were intentionally vague. Male subject, vehicle under question, possible match. Each phrase left room for interpretation. And interpretation, when guided by bias, rarely favors the innocent. Bruce listened carefully. He noticed how the story was being shaped in real time. The description grew less precise, more suggestive. The pauses between transmissions became longer, heavier. The radio crackled, then went silent again. And in that silence, something dangerous was forming, a narrative. Across the street, more eyes had gathered. People weren't staring aggressively. That would have been easier. Instead, they watched with uncertainty, letting the uniforms do the thinking for them. This is how reputations begin to erode. Not with proof, but with public doubt. Bruce felt it. Not fear, not anger, but awareness. He understood that once an image is planted in the minds of others, it becomes difficult to remove. A man standing next to police officers doesn't look neutral. He looks guilty, regardless of truth. One of the officers asked another question. Why would someone like you be driving a car like this? It wasn't officially recorded. It wasn't shouted. It was delivered casually, almost conversational. And that made it worse, because it confirmed what Bruce already knew. This was never about the vehicle. The car was just the excuse. The real issue was something unspoken, something implied, something that could never be written into a report but shaped every decision being made. Bruce responded evenly. He explained again. Ownership, registration, identity. His voice was steady, his words measured. He gave them no reaction to exploit. Still, nothing changed. A third patrol car slowed as it passed. Not to stop, just to observe. The message was clear. This situation was now being treated as noteworthy. Serious. Worth attention. The longer it continued, the harder it would be for the officers to walk it back. Because authority doesn't like being wrong. The first officer glanced at Bruce, then away, then back again. There was a flicker of uncertainty, brief, almost invisible. What was there? A moment where reality threatened the assumption. And assumptions don't collapse quietly. They resist. The radio finally crackled again. A response was coming. Bruce could tell by the way the officer stiffened slightly, by the way his posture changed. Whatever was about to be said would either justify everything that had happened or undo it. But before the message could be fully delivered, the officer interrupted. "Stand by," he said into the radio. Stand by. He wasn't ready yet. Not ready to hear something that might expose the mistake already made. Not ready to accept that this entire escalation had been unnecessary. That hesitation mattered, because it showed something deeply human and deeply dangerous. When people in power realize they may be wrong, they often delay the truth, hoping the moment will pass, or that reality will bend to match their decision. Bruce remained silent. His calm was now unmistakable. It contrasted sharply with the growing tension around him. Where others might have pleaded or protested, he stood grounded, composed, almost immovable. That calm began to change the atmosphere. The onlookers noticed. The imbalance became harder to ignore. A man behaving with dignity didn't match the threat they had been subconsciously expecting. The emotional pressure had peaked. The situation could no longer remain unresolved. And somewhere in that delay, in that refusal to immediately accept the truth, a line had been crossed that could not be uncrossed. Because once authority acts on bias in public view, the consequences don't disappear with an apology. They multiply. And the moment the truth finally came through that radio, everything was about to shift. Irreversibly, the radio crackled again. This time, no one interrupted it. Static filled the air for a brief second. Then a clear voice came through, calm, precise, official. The kind of voice that doesn't speculate. The kind that deals in records, not assumptions. Vehicle status confirmed. No theft report. Registration valid. Owner verified. The words landed softly, but their impact was seismic. For a moment, nothing moved. The street didn't suddenly return to normal. The onlookers didn't disperse. The officers didn't react right away. Silence lingered, thick, uncomfortable, undeniable. Because confirmation doesn't just end an accusation. It exposes it. The first officer stared at the radio as if it had betrayed him. His jaw tightened. His posture shifted, not with relief, but with resistance. He had already invested too much into the story he created. Backing down now meant acknowledging the mistake in front of everyone watching. And authority hates that. The second officer cleared his throat, subtly stepping back, creating distance. Not from BruceLee, but from the situation itself. He could feel the shift. The moment where enforcement turns into exposure. Bruce remained still. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He didn't celebrate. Because vindication doesn't always feel like victory, especially when dignity has already been tested. One of the onlookers whispered something to another. A woman across the street shook her head slightly. Someone else crossed their arms, their expression no longer curious, but concerned. The narrative had changed, and it had changed publicly. Now the question wasn't what did Bruce do? It was why did this happen at all? The first officer took a step toward Bruce, then stopped. His voice, when he finally spoke, lacked the certainty it once had. You're free to go. No apology. No explanation. No acknowledgement of the escalation. Just a release. But releases don't erase what people witnessed. Bruce looked at him, not with anger, not with triumph, but with clarity. A look that said nothing and yet communicated everything. He nodded once, calmly, and walked back toward his car. Each step felt deliberate. Not rushed. Not hesitant. Measured. He opened the door and paused for a brief moment before getting in. Long enough for the silence to stretch again. Long enough for everyone to feel the weight of what had just occurred. Then he drove away. But the story didn't leave with him. Behind him, the officers remained standing in a moment that refused to reset. Because the public doesn't forget contrast. They remember confidence that turned into defensiveness. They remember calm that exposed imbalance. The second officer finally spoke quietly. We should document this. The first officer didn't respond. Because documentation creates records. And records create accountability. Within hours, the incident reached ears it was never meant to reach. A supervisor, an internal desk, a conversation that started with one uncomfortable question. Why was this stop escalated? No theft report. No probable cause. Multiple units involved. Too many decisions made too quickly. The officer's report struggled to explain the gap between suspicion and reality. The language was vague. The justification thin. The timeline inconsistent. And inconsistencies are loud, even when written quietly. What began as a routine stop was now something else entirely. A pattern. A judgment call shaped by perception rather than proof. And in systems built on trust, perception without evidence is dangerous. BruceLee never filed a complaint that day. He didn't need to. The witnesses, the radio logs, the body language, the silence where an apology should have been, all of it told a story that couldn't be rewritten. The tension had broken, but not in the officer's favor. Because when authority is exposed in public, Consequences don't arrive dramatically. They arrive methodically, paper by paper, meeting by meeting, question by question. And once that process begins, it doesn't stop easily. The turning point had passed. What followed next would not be loud. It would not be immediate, but it would be final. Consequences rarely arrive with sirens. They come quietly, wrapped in routine language and formal procedures. No raised voices, no dramatic confrontations, just questions, carefully chosen, deliberately timed. The first meeting happened behind a closed door. The officer sat across from a supervisor who didn't accuse him of anything. That wasn't necessary. The file on the desk already spoke. Timestamps, radio logs, unit responses. Each line painted a picture that felt increasingly difficult to defend. "Walk me through your decision-making," the supervisor said. The officer explained himself the way people do when certainty has faded. His words circled the issue instead of landing on it. He mentioned behavior. He mentioned intuition. He mentioned experience. But intuition isn't policy, and experience doesn't override procedure. The supervisor listened without interruption, then slid one document forward, the vehicle verification record. The timestamp showed how quickly the truth had been available, how easily it could have been confirmed before anything escalated. That moment mattered, because it reframed everything. This wasn't a mistake made in confusion. It was a choice made without confirmation. The second meeting involved internal review, not punitive, procedural, neutral. That's how accountability often begins. The questions were calm, but the implications were serious. Why were additional units requested? Why was the subject treated as a suspect prior to verification? Why was public attention allowed to build without cause? Each answer raised another question. Patterns began to emerge, not just from this incident, but from others like it. Similar language, similar justifications, similar outcomes. Individually, they might have been dismissed. Together, they couldn't be ignored. The power dynamic shifted subtly. Where the officer once controlled the narrative, he was now responding to it. Where he once asked the questions, he was now being asked to explain himself. And explanations don't always hold up under light. Meanwhile, BruceLee moved on. No interviews, no statements, no demands. That restraint amplified the impact. Because when someone chooses dignity over drama, attention shifts naturally toward the system instead of the individual. The story traveled anyway, not as gossip, as concern. People talked about the contrast, the calm man, the escalating authority, the silence after confirmation. It didn't sound like an isolated event. It sounded familiar, and familiarity invites scrutiny. The department initiated formal evaluation. Language mattered. Review, assessment, compliance. Words that suggest neutrality but carry weight. The officer was placed on temporary administrative duty. Not a punishment, officially. A pause. Time to reflect. Time to examine. But pauses are uncomfortable when the future is uncertain. Days turned into weeks. Files were revisited. Reports were compared. Decisions were re-examined with fresh eyes. And what once felt justified began to feel questionable. Because authority isn't just about enforcing rules, it's about embodying them. The final meeting wasn't dramatic. No slammed doors. No raised voices. Just a conclusion drawn from accumulated evidence. The officer was informed that his actions did not align with departmental standards. That his judgment, in this instance and others, had compromised public trust. Trust is fragile. Once broken, it's difficult to restore. The decision was administrative, professional, final. The career didn't end in a single moment. It unraveled, slowly, inevitably, under the weight of its own choices. No one celebrated. That's the thing about accountability. It isn't satisfying. It's necessary. And in its wake, something subtle changed. Training was updated. Procedures were reinforced. Verification became mandatory before escalation. Quiet adjustments, but meaningful ones. Because systems evolve not when they are attacked, but when they're exposed. BruceLee never needed to raise his voice. He didn't need to prove his strength. He didn't need to demand respect. He simply stood still and let the truth do the work. And in doing so, He shifted the balance of power without ever lifting a hand. The incident faded from headlines quickly, but not from memory. Not from those who had witnessed it. Not from those who had participated in it. Not from Bruce Lee himself, who understood the truth in ways few could. He had been tested, not by strength, but by perception. Not by violence, but by bias. Not by an opponent, but by authority. Standing alone later that evening, he reflected on what had just occurred. It was tempting to focus on anger, to dwell on injustice, to imagine retaliatory scenarios. But Bruce Lee had learned early that energy wasted on reaction diminishes clarity. Energy invested in control amplifies it. The lesson was subtle, but profound. Dignity isn't given. It's maintained, even when the world questions it, even when the powerful doubt it, even when truth feels invisible. He thought about the officer. What had driven him? Fear? Prejudice? Habit? Incompetence? Or some combination of all three? Bruce didn't know, and he didn't need to. The officer's choices were already speaking louder than words. Actions have a voice that is impossible to ignore once the consequences begin. And consequences were already unfolding. Quietly, methodically, without fanfare, without spectacle. The officer's career, which had once seemed invincible, was unraveling piece by piece. Each step a reflection of the system correcting itself. Each paper trail a reminder that authority carries responsibility, and responsibility cannot be dismissed without consequence. Bruce realized that the moment on the street had been bigger than a car, bigger than a stop, bigger than an accusation. It had been a lesson in human nature, in power, in accountability, in truth. For every action rooted in bias, there is a reaction, not always immediate, not always dramatic, but inevitable, because the universe and society has ways of restoring balance, sometimes through people, sometimes through systems, sometimes quietly, behind the scenes, without anyone cheering. The moral weight of the day rested not just on the officer, but on the witnesses, on the bystanders, on the structures that allow assumption to masquerade as judgment. Bruce understood that the real work isn't confrontation. It's awareness. It's responsibility. It's the courage to remain calm and principled while the world around you rushes to conclusions. He thought of the onlookers, those who had paused, frozen, unsure what to believe. Their impressions would be lasting. And for them, the lesson was clear. Appearances can mislead. Authority can err. And truth doesn't always announce itself with fanfare, but it endures. This reflection wasn't passive. It was active. It was a quiet force, a reminder that one person, by maintaining control and composure, can expose imbalance without aggression. That power isn't always demonstrated through action. Sometimes it is demonstrated through restraint, through presence, through the simple act of being unwaveringly grounded in reality while chaos swirls around you. Bruce knew that life would present similar moments again, instances where assumptions, bias, or authority would challenge him, where truth might not be immediately recognized, where the stakes could feel as high or higher. But he also knew the same principles would hold: calm, dignity, observation, integrity, and perhaps most importantly, he knew that justice, whether immediate or delayed, has a way of revealing itself to those who are patient, disciplined, and unshakable. It doesn't require fury or force. It simply requires adherence to principle and clarity of mind. As night fell, he looked at the empty streets, at the quiet cars, at the lingering shadows where judgment had once hovered, and he understood the subtle triumph of the day. Not for him, not for glory, not for revenge, but for the quiet restoration of balance. For those willing to watch, for those willing to learn, for those willing to see that real strength isn't always in confrontation. It's in standing firm when the world doubts you, and letting the truth speak for itself. And in that realization, Bruce Lee smiled faintly, not for victory over another, but for victory over the chaos of perception itself. Even after the tension broke and the truth emerged, something lingered in the air. Not a threat, not fear, not anger, a question. A question that no one could answer in that moment, and that would haunt the mind long after the street emptied. What happens when authority is trusted but misused? What happens when a single assumption, rooted in prejudice, has the potential to derail not only one life, but many? The officer who made the accusation had vanished from immediate view, but his choices echoed. Through records, through whispers, through lessons that couldn't be ignored. And for BruceLee, the incident was already fading into the background, but only because he understood something most people never learn. Control is not about dominating others. It's about mastering yourself in the storm. Yet the story didn't end there. Somewhere, in the quiet corridors of the department, conversations were happening. Not dramatized confrontations, not sensational hearings, but the subtle, inevitable mechanisms of accountability. Papers shuffled, emails sent, supervisors spoke in muted tones. Decisions were being documented with precision. The consequences were not instant, but they were inevitable. And that's what makes the story gripping. The tension doesn't conclude with a single punch, a single event, or a single statement. It concludes slowly, subtly, by showing that every action, every assumption, and every abuse of power carries weight. Imagine standing there, watching someone wrongly accused, watching authority make a mistake that seems small at first, watching time stretch as doubt hangs in the air, watching truth inch closer like a silent force, waiting to restore balance. Now imagine knowing that nothing, not fury, not fame, not intimidation, can undo the ripple you've already set in motion, because the system will eventually respond. And in that response, lives shift, careers change, perceptions adjust, trust is rebuilt, but only for those who have patience to witness it, only for those who understand the subtle power of restraint. BruceLee didn't yell. He didn't argue. He didn't react impulsively, but by remaining composed, by letting evidence speak, and by trusting truth over assumption, he became more powerful than anyone in uniform standing over him. Not stronger with fists, but stronger with clarity, presence, and principle. And yet, here's the twist that keeps your mind racing. The story isn't about him. It's about all of us. Because each time we assume, each time we judge, each time we let bias guide decisions, we're faced with the same moral test. And when consequences eventually arrive, will we be prepared to face them? Or will we be unmasked in the quiet aftermath, exposed by truth we ignored? That is the hook. The tension that lingers in your mind long after the video ends. The psychological trap that turns spectators into participants. The emotional pull that forces you to ask questions you don't yet have answers to. And here's what keeps it alive. The incident may have been brief, just minutes on a street, seconds in a life. But its lessons stretch across hours, days, and even generations. What would you do if you were in that moment? How would you respond if assumptions threatened your dignity? And how would the world respond when truth finally emerges? Not in dramatic fashion, but with quiet, undeniable authority. Those are the questions that stay with you. The questions that loop in your mind. The questions that make this story impossible to forget. Because BruceLee didn't just survive the moment. He made it a lesson, a subtle, powerful, enduring lesson about courage, truth, and the unseen consequences of human error. And now, it's your turn to decide. Will you recognize bias when it shows up? Will you stay calm when the world rushes to judgment? Or will you let assumptions define the outcome before truth has a chance to speak?